Good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Blass, and I'm the Regional Director in the UK for the ISF. It's a real pleasure to be with you today as we kick off this series of three key webinars. Our topic for today is digital transformation in the oil and gas industry for the modern cybersecurity landscape. Today, I'm joined by my colleague Nick Frost, who's an ISF Principal Consultant, and who'll be moderating this session. Our guest speakers are Kevin Sarstedt, the CEO of Chrysalis Energy. It's a consultancy that focuses on digitisation and cybersecurity in the oil and gas sector. Kevin has over 40 years' experience in the energy sector and is also the vice chair of the Oil and Gas Security Special Interest Group. Daniel Brown is the executive director of CDA, a subsidiary of OG UK, which is the leading representative body for the UK offshore oil and gas industry. Daniel is the data and digital lead for OJ UK and also chair of the Society for Petroleum Data Managers. Sakthi Norton is the delivery manager for CDA and also manages the UK National Data Repository Service. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Recorded Future, for their support in making this possible. It's really great to see so many ISF members and also non-members from so many different countries that have registered for this event, and I do hope it will be of value to you. So with that, Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. And hello, everybody. Thanks all for joining this webinar today. Got a great lineup, and I think a real interest in this particular area, especially from our interaction also with ISF members around this sort of transformation in the digitization in this particular sector, and of course its associated cybersecurity risks as well. So what we're going to do here is we're going to kick off with some questions to the panel, get the discussions going, set the scene. I'd certainly encourage if you could put forward your questions as well, and we will get through as many of those as we can. So just a little bit of a background here. We have Dan and Sakthi, as Bill mentioned. They've produced a really insightful report around data digitization and maturity survey, basically within the sector. And what we're going to do is introduce Kevin, who's going to then sort of provide that sort of cybersecurity perspective, if you like. So we're looking at some of these key changes going on in digitization in this industry, but also incorporate some of the cybersecurity aspects as well. So without further ado, Dan, I'm going to ask you if you could give us an idea, if you like. We've got digitization and going digital, if you like. They're sort of key terms that that came across in the report, and they're commonly being used within the oil and gas industry. But is there a common understanding of what digitization is, how it's seen within the industry?
Thank you, Nick. I think these phrases are evolving as rapidly as this part of industry is as well. So whether it's digitization, digitalization, going digital. But I think what we are seeing, though, is the language itself is transforming to reflect the transformation that industry is going through. If you look from the kind of the early 90s through to the 2000s, a lot of the investment in digital was essentially trying to take manual processes and create a digital version of those. And that kind of trajectory has gone on for the last 10 or 20 years. I think with the rise of companies like Amazon and Google and those companies that didn't have a paper heritage, there's a realization that if you start from scratch and then you have a look at how your business operates through an entirely digital lens, you actually get to a different answer that is better, perhaps orders of magnitude better in some senses, than if you take what you've got and then you simply apply digital techniques to it. So I think digitalization is that much broader look at how your business operates, what its inputs are, what its outputs are, how it creates value, and where there's waste in that process, and applying digital techniques to try and deliver the best version of that process for your business. And when you do that, you deliver something that can be markedly different, quite surprising in many ways, based on what you thought your business was set up to do. And what we saw through our study was that a lot of the operators and supply chain in oil and gas, for the past 20, 30 years, an awful lot of investment in digital. But investment in digitalization, this true transformative approach to how a company works, has only really started to take place since maybe 2014, 2015. So there's just perhaps 5 years at most of investment in digitalization in this industry. I hope that helps a little bit in terms of what we think these words mean.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And Sakthi, if I might sort of just bring you in here then. So, here in the UK and Europe, the sort of concept of digitization, has, really gripped the industry. But from your observations over the past, 2 or 3 years, as Dan referenced there, it appears that the supply chain is making all the advances, but some of the clients seem to be a bit reluctant to adopt these sort of new tools, new ways of working. So, does the survey that yourself and Dan have been involved in, show this as well? Does it highlight this? Is there any statistics or observations you might want to highlight here?
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. Yes, it's quite true what you've just said there. There's a lot more of digital transformation, shall we say, happening in the supply chain. And while the supply chain's influences are obviously, their clients and the clients' clients, it's the natural food chain, as it were, and operators tend to sit at the top of that. We don't see from the survey, we're not seeing as much of that influence in the digitalization coming top down, but nor are we seeing that influence being taken up. There's very few operators who are integrating their suppliers into their digital transformation programs. So it is an interesting factor that we are very interested in understanding more about. Why exactly we don't have the answers to that just yet, but that is certainly the case. That is what we are seeing at the moment.
Okay, and I think Dan, if I can just come back to you then. So that sort of trend that we're seeing is probably a really important one that needs to be addressed. And I'm saying that because, with your operators, they're going to be, highly dependent on suppliers and the supply chain. I mean, you can pretty much say most industry sectors are these days, but, in the oil and gas, there's going to be a huge dependence on those suppliers. So for streamlining, if you like, their processes, it's vital to get that more holistic view, if you like, to integrate the digitization.
I think this is a really challenging area. And so we're part of OGUK, the trade association for the offshore industry, and that organisation has been looking at the question of collaboration within the UK industry for many years now, trying to track the progress that operators and supply chain have been making in order to work together. And I think what our survey has been showing us is that it's the operators and supply chain have been starting on their digitalization journey with those challenges which are to a degree internal to them. So within the operators, they've been doing a lot of work on making better use of the data they have, a lot of progress in how that data is organized and well managed, and then starting to use tools like the BI tools, business analytics tools, in order to understand the quality of the data they have, whether it's giving them the right insights, and then starting to use those insights in their business processes. So I guess this is the low-hanging fruit of how an operator in supply chain companies might kind of choose to work internally to make their business process a little bit more digitally enabled. The next challenge then is, how do you do that between the operator and the various supply chain companies? To dig into this in our survey, we looked at the question of trust in data in the supply chain. We saw that if within an organization, if you ask somebody if they trust their data, they will say probably yes, if that data is something that's within their own organization. But when they look to data that is received by other companies, so other companies in their supply chain, that
Yeah.
level of trust drops to about something like 14%, I think. So there's
Right.
a lot of work to be done to build the digital business model, the digital underpinnings that enable data and information to be transferred across the supply chain to operators in a manner that's trusted, in a manner that's secure, and then enables
Yeah.
a higher level of cross supply chain digital activity. So there's a lot of work going on already, but particularly where you're in the space of the supply chain, where there's contracts involved, and perhaps those contracts do specify how you do things. Perhaps those contracts don't
Yeah.
specify enough or clearly enough or with the right standards in them how you can
Mm.
work and collaborate effectively across the supply chain.
Mm.
We suspect there's an awful lot of work there left to do.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. I'm going to come back to that around that trust and collaborate because I think Bill and I have certainly seen that in the ISF and a number of other industry sectors, and it is a continuing challenge. Kevin, if I might shift over to you from the cybersecurity perspective. So, what we're hearing here is that supply chain, as the supply chain digitizes, if you like, this is inevitably going to increase the attack surface, if you like, or information security risks to the client organizations and the integrated supply chain as well. So I'm just wondering, now it almost feels like, from a cybersecurity perspective, it feels like actually quite a good time because, reading the report and hearing what Dan and Sakthi have highlighted is they're going through this, I suppose you could say, a fairly, early stage, embryonic stage of integrating digitization and supply chain. So it feels like a good time to get cybersecurity embedded in that too. But I've got two questions. One is, could you just maybe highlight some of the concerns that you have with this slowly early integration, if you like, of digitization in the supply chain for the oil and gas industry? And maybe just give us a few hints and tips on organizations that are looking at this, what, in terms of what good looks like.
I think there's actually some really fundamental challenges that the industry is actually going to have to face. In the 18 months that I've been involved in the OG UK Special Interest Group, what's come forward very, very strongly is that from a supply chain perspective, the supply chain is very eager to understand what its responsibilities are in relation to protecting their own data, because they appreciate that if they have vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the way in their own information management security arrangements, that's going to follow through with their own client relationships, and they don't want to compromise those relationships. So they're eager to learn, and they're eager to understand how they can work with the client organizations. But there's also the challenge within some of the client organizations where they take the view that they are all powerful, they're all knowing, and they will dictate the terms. Coming back to the issue of collaboration, they don't see this as a collaborative requirement. They see this as a command and control requirement, and I think that also that there is potentially a lack of understanding at the executive level and the C-suite level within both operating companies and contracting companies about the importance of information security, really understanding the value of the data that they have in their organizations. They're over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been this expression coined that data is going to be the new oil. The problem is that people do not understand where the value of the data within their own organization lies. And the trouble is, if you're starting from a position of a lack of understanding of what the true value of your data is, you can't protect it. And therefore, if you get a breach, what will happen is that you will get the bad actor making implicit assumptions about the value of data as they see it to their organization, which may not necessarily be correct. So the organization may actually benefit from not having quite a severe cyber breach as it could have endured. But I think that there is a fundamental recalibration of organizations needing to go back and truly look at where the true value of the data is within their organization, and put in the security postures and the various protection measures to protect that data.
Okay. So what we're saying here is very much number one, understand where your mission critical assets are. And
Absolutely.
I suppose then, assess. So it's more risk driven. Identify the risks and then ensure that you've got the right controls according to the risk. So let me just expand on that then. So from what you said there, do you think there's a danger then of the operators in particular feeling that they can outsource a service and they can outsource the risk, when the reality is you can't outsource the risk? Are we in that kind of situation?
Absolutely, no. You're absolutely right. Historically, that has been the case. I actually see that there's potentially a fundamental change coming down the tracks. A lot of the supply chain and perhaps the operators do not fully appreciate yet. And this was actually made brought it into clear focus for me last year when I was actually at the ADIPEC conference in the UAE, and I had the privilege of actually attending an executive roundtable where they were actually discussing digitization with a lot of the senior leaders within the oil and gas community globally. And what was quite stark was that there was a recognition that, and this was actually coming from a very senior director within Saudi Aramco, and basically what he was saying was that he is seeing the supply chain digitizing. So what they're doing is they are improving their service offering, but they're still offering the same service on day rate contracts. And that's not what Saudi Aramco wants. What Saudi Aramco wants is basically a total reimagining of what the service offering is going to be, which will potentially mean the complete destruction of the supply chain and the actual internalization of that supply chain within the operating organizations to a larger degree. So that's what I'm saying, and that's perhaps the most catastrophic view that you can have. But when you've got digitization going on, what you've got to remember is that you've got to separate the whole idea of improvement from innovation. Innovation is about revolution, and that's what we're beginning to experience now. In the industry with digitization, the expectation is that we're going to revolutionize the way we do things. And if you look at professional services, if you look at the retail sector, if you look at the tech sector, if you look at pharmaceuticals, they are revolutionizing the way in which they do their business. They have to, because it's the only way they're going to stay profitable or enhance their profitability. So they have what we call true innovation processes. within the oil and gas sector, historically, because of the way it's evolved, it hasn't had that need. It's
Okay.
primarily relied on an improvement process. So
Yeah.
if you compare innovation processes versus improvement processes, the oil and gas sector has got a long way to go, and it potentially can
Right.
destroy itself in the process.
Okay.
To give you
All
an
right.
example, we've all heard of Uber. There is a small startup in Aberdeen which is called Seaplan, and it has got a platform which is equivalent to Uber, but for marine shipping, for the supply vessels and for DSVs. If that was truly implemented, the whole of the supply chain market would actually disintegrate.
Right. Okay. All right. So, Dan, if I can come back to you, thanks for that, Kevin. Dan, if I can come back to you. So, one of the things that we're hearing there, obviously, there's a bit of a lag phase in this oil and gas sector, and probably, for very, very solid business reasons as to why there's a delay. Maybe there's just been a sort of a self capability, if you like, in terms of the sector. One of the things I'm picking up on from what Kevin said, and something that I picked out sort of from your report, is around the culture. And I suppose the question I have, which is a kind of a $6 million question, so no pressure. How can we accelerate? How can we accelerate the culture to sort of adopt this quicker? That's one question. And the second question, I'd actually like to sort of ask Sakthi to sort of highlight this, because Sakthi, you mentioned earlier about the top-down approach, and I'm just wondering if you could, after Dan's talked about culture, if you could talk a little bit about the governance and trying to get leadership and senior management to understand the value and benefit, but also making sure to get this digitization transformation right as well. So Dan, if you could kick us off with the cultural side of things.
Okay, thank you for that. Thinking about the oil and gas industry itself, this is a very capital intensive, very risk averse industry for very obvious reasons. So in that context, it is quite understandable that when change is made, it's made very, very carefully with lots of good planning and lots of good risk assessment, management of change, all of those things. So we can expect in this industry that when change comes, we're careful in terms of how we do that, and rightly so. The challenge that Kevin brings then is how do you manage the rate of change that is now needed within industry in the context of delivering that change in a safe, compliant, properly risk managed way. And in an industry which thinks about assets of 30, 40-year lifespans, thinks about control systems, I think historically with a similar sort of lifespan, there are real challenges there in terms of how you bring that change into reality. The other kind of systems that are built within the oil and gas industry are those that manage your maintenance planning, your maintenance management, your ERP systems. Again, typically built with a view of lasting you for periods of years and decades almost, rather than kind of weeks and months in terms of going from one change to the next. So there is this challenge here in terms of moving from a long-term asset-heavy piece of thinking to something which is much shorter term, much more agile in terms of how it operates. I think as an industry, we still have some thinking to do about how we deal with that conflict between a greater pace of change in terms of our business process and how we wish to operate, and then how we reflect that in the IT systems, the control systems, and those other systems that are out there that actually control and ensure that whatever we're doing that in a manner that's safe and is going to protect ourselves, our industry, environment, and those who work for us. There are some fairly, I mean, from the survey we did, there are some fairly obvious things that we can do to get started on this, though. First of which was, I mean, we asked in our survey questions around the nature of the innovation process that organizations have. So how do you innovate? How do you collect ideas? How do you rank those ideas? How do you turn those ideas into change in your organization? And we discovered that a substantial number of organizations, whether in the supply chain or whether operators, still don't actually have an end-to-end innovation process in their organization. So given that, it's certainly in those organizations, you can then see a challenge in terms of how good ideas from the workplace can make their way up to those leaders who have the capital and decision-making authority to make those ideas real. So the simple things organizations can do, such as just get an email inbox together, ideas@yourcompanyhere.com, get some ideas sent into there, publicize it, put a few posters up, put a few digital posters up, I guess, in this lockdown world that we're in. And then you need a pretty simple business process with your leaders to make sure your ideas are looked at, and then to rank them and to fund those which are have a clear business case. And again, in the environment that we're in, cash is not easy to come by. But certainly those ideas that can pay back in 3 months, 6 months, a year, I certainly hope within organizations that are out there, there's still space for listening to those ideas that can save more money by investing a little bit of money in them. So I think there's some relatively straightforward things that organizations can work on in order to get the basics of innovation right. I think I should hand over to Sakthi now to move the conversation forward.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dan. Exactly over to you. I think if we could, I suppose, get a perspective of the governance. I mean, just going back to the challenges with the supply chain and the dependency on the supply chain. And I think one of the points there that was clear to me from what Kevin was saying, maybe there's a lack of appreciation about the potential impact of mission critical data that may be being handled by a supplier, and the importance to ensure that you identify those risks and manage those risks. And with that in sort of context, I'm just wondering if you can give us an overview in terms of what organizations, operators can do from a governance perspective to ensure that we have senior management visible to both the benefits and the risks with digitization.
Sure, thank you. I was taken by Kevin's point about going back to understand the value of the data and the risk, obviously, that of losing that data or losing that value. We, CDA, did some work 10 years ago now on trying to quantify that value of data. We found that at the time, it was about a quarter to a third of business value came from the data.
Right.
That was 10 years ago now, and we're trying to understand, is that still the case? How has that value changed? I think firstly, being able to understand the value and therefore the risks as well, that is a really important piece to start with. So that is something that we're working on, trying to explore a bit further as well. But along with that is, it's not just about the value of data in itself. There's considering and understanding. Leadership need to understand the value of managing that data and the governance piece, as you mentioned. And again, that is something that absolutely is not fully or consistently understood and appreciated across the industry. And again, that is an element that CDA has historically, been working on and continues to champion. It comes back again to the culture and capability piece of it as well. It's being able to understand what you need to do to manage your data and manage your risks and value. Who needs to be able to do that? What they need to know to be able to do that? The competencies that are involved, and especially with the way things are going with digitalization, with just the outcomes of the survey that we've had. We're really understanding that capability piece is what needs to be worked on. That capability, digital literacy, those digital expectations, it really is a continuum. We've seen that training and development and capability have, for a very long time, focused on the use of tools, the use of systems. There hasn't been that wider capability development in developing digital literacy, digital culture across the organization, the entire workforce, including the leadership as well. So again, something that we're trying to explore a bit more now is understanding that continuum of the digital competencies required across the workforce, and which roles need, where they need to sit on that continuum.
Yes, yeah.
I think having that in place then empowers the leadership to be able to, to know that they do have the right governance in place, and then to be able to trust within an organization, to trust their workforce, to be able to innovate and to drive, that innovation as well. But on a, then to scale that up, to be able to trust their supply chain, to be able to bring that in. So it's being able to understand, the governance that's required, and having the capability to be assured that the right governance is in place, then lets you trust your workforce, your supply chain. So, absolutely digitalization. And so it does need to be led top down, but innovation has to come bottom up. So it has, it has to be, innovation has to be bottom up driven, but top down empowered, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. I think you summarized that really well, and thank you for that, because it gives me a really nice question now to pose to Kevin. So,
That's
Kevin,
fine.
given the fact that, as Sakthi mentioned there, that this whole we definitely, in the oil and gas industry, there's a huge amount of innovation going on, and I think just touching on some of Dan's point, it's actually seems to be well positioned, because the culture is, I think Dan was talking about, making sure we get things right, and having worked in oil and gas before myself, I know this engineering culture is actually highly advantageous, if you like, to take these innovative ideas and actually, look at them thoroughly, rigorously, and do something with them. But so we don't want to slow that down. But the other point, as Sakti's mentioned there, is the need for governance and for recognition, both of the value that can be driven from digitization, but appreciation also that the risks associated with it. So, Kevin, my question to you is: it feels like we need this kind of steering committee, something in between. And there been Dan and Sakthi both mentioned about getting the right roles involved. In your ideal sort of, the panacea, what would that steering committee look like to ensure that we are driving digitization, but we're doing so in a manner that's appreciating the potential risks with that and with the supply chain?
Are you talking about an industry-based steering committee? Or are you talking about an organizational-based steering committee?
Oh no, sorry, an organizational based. And just to try and understand, if I was an operator, I don't have this steering committee. Ideally, what are the types of roles that I should have involved in this, and what really should be the steering committee's, objective?
I think the digital revolution is going to require a paradigm shift in leadership, and I was actually quite heartened. I was recently on a webinar, and a guy from BP in Houston was one of the speakers, and for the first time I heard the expression servant-based leadership. Now, for the leaders around us, if you're a good leader, then you already appreciate what that means. Servant-based leadership is actually listening to your personnel, your employees, all of your stakeholders, engaging with them and empowering them to be able to do their jobs. Historically, the oil and gas industry has unfortunately been very much of the ilk of command and control. You do as you're told, you do it when you're told, and you do it how you're told. with this digitization revolution, you are going to need participation from new entrants coming into the industry. And if you don't get it, and it's beginning to happen already, that if you get new graduates coming into the industry, or people with master's degrees coming into the industry, if they don't see any change within 18 months to 2 years, they will leave. And it's happening already. I've attended a couple of conferences recently where there have been graduates with 3 and 4 years experience. They've seen what's been going on with the digital revolution, and they've got quite excited. After 18 months, they've seen within their host organizations, that the organization hasn't moved at all. In fact, in some cases, it's moved backwards, because they're fearful to actually engage with adoption of technology. And therefore, what that is doing is that's forcing a re-examination by those individuals of whether or not they want to stay in the industry and stay within that organization. Because what they've done is they've gained experience, valuable experience, both of working in safety critical industries, capital intensive industries, and organizations which are trying to develop their own digital identity and digital culture and digital strategy. So they are very, very marketable people. So if the industry doesn't get a grip of the fundamental culture change which is going to be needed, then it's going to be hamstrung for the future. So coming back to your question about what I would see a steering committee consisting of within a client organization, it would be very much like what I would call a European Work Council structure, where you have representation from all levels within the organization, as well as the C-suite. It has to, because what you can't do is you can't get barriers from the middle management permafrost layer. Cutting off innovation at the knees. You've got to have channels of communication from the bottom of the organization to the top of the organization to say, what you're doing isn't working. You need to do this, and you need to do this for this X, Y, and Z reason. And they need to empower the people at the bottom to do it. You get that kind of revolutionary thinking in organizations like particularly automotive, where they've had these ideas of quality circles and this whole idea of end-to-end innovation processes for years now, because if they don't innovate and develop, they'll die. That's why we've had so much adoption of digital technology within the automotive industry, because they can see that if they don't do it themselves, somebody else will do it within their organization. You can just look at Tesla. Look at what Elon Musk is doing. He threw down the gauntlet. He wanted a purely electric car, and within 5 years he did it. And he's trying to disrupt the whole of the automotive industry. So they've come on board with electrification and looking at alternative methods of powering their cars. So unless you have that fundamental paradigm shift in leadership, the industry, you're going to have a two-speed industry, and we're going to be, unfortunately, we're going to be in the second division. We're going to die by a death of 1,000 cuts.
Okay, all right, thank you for that.
I'm sorry if that's the reality of it.
Can I come in there, Nick? And,
yeah, please, Dan. Yes.
So just thinking in terms of how this plays out in the North Sea. So in terms of the survey we performed and the companies that we've talked to, we've seen quite a few different approaches to how digitalization is being delivered within industry, and kind of realizing from that the approach companies are taking to this digital revolution that we're on is really dependent upon the nature of the company itself, whether they are a substantial multinational organization which can look at digital as a core competency it wants to build inside itself and then thoroughly digitize its entire organization, or whether it's
Mm.
perhaps venture capital funded and hence is somewhat more constrained in terms of the cash that's available, very much focused in terms of return on that capital employed, and is then perhaps
Yes.
looking at the partnerships that it can establish in order to bring in digital competencies, which it perhaps doesn't then wish to develop internally in order to get after the digital value that's out there. I mean, we've seen companies in Aberdeen, so companies like Chrysalis have been partnering with organizations like OPEX, Petrofac partnering with Accenture in order to strike very strong partnerships in relation to the mix of business insight and search for the value, search for the impact on the bottom line that digitalization brings, while recognizing that perhaps it doesn't make economic sense in those organizations to build those capabilities in-house.
Mm.
In terms of how this change is manifesting in the North Sea, again, you can see different paces of change. So Equinor with its Mariner development of a digital frontrunner, looking at how you can take best of breed digital technologies and deploy them within a single asset, and then use that as the as is experimental animal the right phrase, but it's certainly their vehicle to understand what works, what doesn't, to in the vernacular fail fast where it's appropriate to do that,
Yes.
and then start
Yeah.
to understand really where digital can make an impact in their business. We mentioned at the
Okay.
start that digitalization has really only been running for 3 or 4 years in many organizations. And in that time, frankly, we haven't seen, perhaps in terms of from an industry perspective, terribly much outside the organizations that have been talked about, except for things like there's Total's Lane development, there's Mariner in the North Sea, there's a few others out there. An enormous amount of effort, though, has gone on internally in those organizations to rethink how their business processes work, to look at the agile playbook and understand how agile business processes, how agile working can help you rethink how your business itself operates. We're starting to see the phrase product owner pop up in all sorts of job titles all over the world now. So perhaps agile is now reaching the peak of the hype curve and is maybe a little bit oversold. But in terms of the basics of digitalization, short development cycles, getting value delivered very quickly, or realizing very quickly that what you're doing isn't going to work, and then trying to pursue other business objectives. That style of thinking is now becoming quite pervasive, certainly in the UK industry, and we see that as very positive in terms of the culture change that's needed in order to keep us moving forwards. I think we just have a little bit longer to go yet before we're truly going to see all of that value out there on the ground. And then it's certainly possible that that this two-tier approach that Kevin describes, that we may see a little bit of that, because those companies that have been investing, have been thinking about this, have been finding the digital path that works for them, I expect they're going to be a fair bit further on now than those which have been following a somewhat more traditional approach. There's still time to catch up. There's still time for those organizations to invest and look at how their own organization works. But certainly, when we argue that digital gives you a competitive advantage, and so it's perhaps natural that we're going to start to see some organizations becoming more competitive than others as a consequence of the investments they've made. So yeah, there's a lot of change, but a lot of progress out there already.
Good.
Nick, can I just come in?
Okay. Yes, before you do, Kevin, could I just remind people that they could submit their questions. One or two have come through to me directly, so I'll ask these to you, Kevin, in a minute. But please carry on, Kevin.
Just to pick up on what Dan was saying there about the difference between an IOC and a private equity based operator. I would potentially put Dan's arguments, switch Dan's argument on its head, because I would suggest that the reality of a private equity backed operator is that what they're always doing is they're always looking for value within that organization. with a view to selling it on as quickly as they can. Their time horizon is somewhere between 7 to 10 years, and at the outside 12. Now, if the chief executive or the leadership team of that operating company goes to the private equity backers and says, look, we've got this digitalization strategy, which is going to create value that's going to double the value of your investment by 3 or 4 times in 2 or 3 years, they will find the funds to make that happen for you, because they're going to reap the rewards of that. So I think there needs to be a realization that just because you're private equity backed doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have the financial resources to actually capitalize on the digital revolution.
Yeah, indeed.
And
Okay.
Nick, sorry, could I jump in as well there?
Yes.
Perhaps herding cats a bit here for you. But
Everyone wants to talk now.
I know, if I could be a bit left field maybe. So Dan's talked about organizational culture, and I was taken by Nick's point earlier on about that sort of fear of change as well, and fear of adoption. And I think there's a real psychological element, an occupational psychological element to this, that it would do leaders well to understand better. We came across a very interesting paper from Robert Gordon's Aberdeen Business School, so from the perspective of the business school and occupational psychology as well. And those psychological barriers to technology adoption, there's not a lot of work being done on this, but there is actually quite a bit to explore there. There's obviously, social factors, financial factors, compliance sector. There's a range of psychological factors that come into play. And ultimately, when it comes to leadership, it's decision makers who have to look at the information and the data in front of them and then make that decision. What risk am I willing to, is this organization willing to take? What value do I place importance on and am willing to invest in? And when it comes to leadership, we do a lot on understanding your leadership style, understanding your leadership team, organizational makeup, and so on. I think it would be quite useful for leaders to actually understand their risk motivators as well, understanding their the risk factors that speak to them, to be able to then look further into the business points and the business information that they can then get in order to assuage those factors that apply to them quite personally as well. So in terms of leadership, I think understanding your own risk profile is a very useful thing to do here.
Thanks, Sakthi. And actually, as you talk about those psychological factors, it reminded me of probably about 15 years ago when, trying to get businesses to adopt ideas like the cloud, and back then it was this crazy idea. Why would we, allow a supplier to host our information? And then what we tended to see pretty much across both industry sectors with the downturn we had in 2008, the financial pressures, the accelerated capabilities of suppliers, both these 2 points met, and then suddenly cloud adoption was considered to be, the way forward. So I totally understand this psychological aspect and why it's important for that to be considered when you're trying to understand an individual sort of risk acceptance or otherwise. Okay, I've got a question that's come through, and I'm conscious of time here. So, Kevin, this is kind of a general sort of question, I suppose, but in your perspective, what are you seeing across industry now? What are you seeing as the sort of key cyber risks, cyber threats? And given the context of what we've talked about here, can we kind of group these into, the intentional adversarial versus the, maybe the accidental to do with the cultural aspects? But if we can just maybe get a view from yourself, what that cyber threat horizon looks like for the oil and gas industry.
I think the from what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is that it's a lot of the threat is still coming from trying to get I think there's a realization in what I would call the bad actor community that
Okay.
there's such a lot of technology out there to defend organizations that what they're focusing on now is they've gone back to focusing on the weakest link, which are humans. So there
Yeah.
is definitely an increase in I would say the greatest threat is the targeting of personnel through phishing
Okay.
emails and scams and that kind of thing. So that is the biggest thing. And what's quite interesting is that there was some research done probably in the last 12 or 18 months, which was looking across various cohorts and organizations. And what they discovered was that the two most vulnerable cohorts were actually the C-suite level and the millennials. And the reason why the C-suite level were vulnerable was because they thought they knew it all. The
Yeah.
reason why the millennials were vulnerable is because they had grown up with technology and they were a bit complacent about it, because they didn't appreciate the security implications of the data that they were sharing.
Okay.
And I thought what was quite I was listening in on a I think it was an OG UK hosted webinar just the other week, and they were talking about inclusion. That was the topic of the discussion, and what was interesting was that the the issue was about using social media platforms to cultivate agile cultures within organizations. And what was interesting was that the millennial organization thought that was a great idea, but there was a bit of reticence from other cohorts within the organizations. They were a bit fearful of that. But when you start to use social media platforms as a way of building culture, you've also got to think about the cybersecurity implications of actually sharing that data, because you get an awful lot of
Yeah.
data leakage when you start using social media platforms.
Yeah.
And so yes, you can have internal social media platforms like Yammer, but inevitably there will be cross sharing across platforms unless
Right.
you've got a very, very strong security policy and security posture which actually stops that.
Yeah.
Which again,
Yeah.
if you have that degree of restriction, you're going to alienate your workforce. So
Yes.
there's a great what's the word I'm looking for? Oh, words going out of my head.
You end up with
Balance.
a
There's a great balance to be drawn about how much freedom you give your personnel, and what level of restriction to actually and that itself creates a degree of cyber risk for the organization.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, that's quite an interesting one, because I think that goes to the point that the both Sakthi and Dan mentioned, which you could end up with a potential class of cultures where, as you say, if you instill this sort of very stringent way of working from a security point of view, you could start to upset the millennials, the people, the young sort of employees coming into the organization, which ultimately is not what you want to do. Okay, thank you for that. just to let everybody know, please submit your questions. Dan and Sakthi, I've got a question for you now, and this is one that I think I resonate with as well. So, and this goes back to my experience with Schlumberger, when actually I do remember digitisation. I remember things like, the virtual reservoirs you could walk through, and at these conferences used to have in London. So, in the early 2000s, it was clear with Shell and BP, with their smart fields and the 4D seismics, gave us a glimpse of what the sort of future in terms of digitisation looked like. And I remember myself, it was super exciting. The resolution wasn't great like it is today. But what happened to all of that? That we seem to be sort of, in the sector then, we seem to be sort of years ahead of a lot of other sectors. So was the adoption just too early on, too optimistic? What happened? Any views from your side to that question that we've received?
Dan, I'll let you go first.
That's a lovely question, Nick. I could speculate, and I see there's a lot of cycles in the oil and gas industry. So every few years, the oil price goes up, and then it goes down, and then we invest, we experiment, we work with technology, and then typically the oil price falls, and then the industry kind of shutters itself down for a piece, and then we open up, and then we do the same backwards again. So I think there's been waves of progress. And I think there's possibly been waves of retrenchment as we've gone through these processes, and I feel we're sort of going through the same thing now. So the 2014 was another wave where the oil price fell, and I think a lot of activity, except for what was absolutely required in order to keep the hydrocarbons moving, came to an end. I think now I hope we're in a slightly different place. The sense of lower for longer has been around for a few years, and I don't see any immediate sign of that changing. So I think we're now starting to adjust to learn to invest in a lower oil price environment where we're expecting focus on margins and focus on profitability to be absolutely front and center of executive minds for a long time to come. And I think that actually creates a much more fertile ground for the opportunities through digital in order to create and then embed the efficiencies that are out there. And we've done Field of the Future, we've done all of those things. The next thing that's out there is properly getting value from digital twins, so product lifecycle management from an oil and gas perspective. Truly understanding the entire infrastructure makeup you have, the linkage between that infrastructure and the subsurface and pipelines, how the entirety of your system of your organization works, and then using that as the basis for how information moves between the operators and the supply chain, so that instead of everybody emailing scanned PDFs of P&IDs around to each other, we can just work simply within the single digital system of truth. There's orders of magnitude of efficiency improvement if you can make that sort of thing work. But I touch on Kevin's points around difficulties around the digital complexity of the environment we now live in, how to make that a safe, secure, effective way to work, how to build that kind of trust in the supply chain, how to deal with all the issues of digital complexity we have offshore, where we have everybody wandering around with handheld cameras, smartphones, PDAs, devices. And back 15, 20 years ago, you had to get a permit to take a mobile phone out into the EX areas of a platform. Now it seems they are absolutely everywhere. So the digital complexity of the offshore environment is orders of magnitude greater than it was just a few years ago. So dealing with the opportunity that comes from that in terms of having trusted, reliable data inputted at the time it's collected and then available for use, versus the cyber and other risk challenges that are out there in terms of the increased attack surface that's there. There's both of these things need to move together kind of hand in hand in order to improve our digital effectiveness, but at the same time do that in a way that is safe, risk managed, and also that cognitively we can cope with it in terms of the occupational and psychological aspects of that as well.
Okay, good. Sakthi, any last comments from yourself?
No, very much what Dan was saying. Technologies, they tend to be quite fashionable, don't they? They come and go in cycles. And I think we're at this this stage of the cycle where we're taking a step back and we really are looking at things a lot more holistically. Exactly, what we've been seeing from our digital study as well. It's that integrating across your business and not just focusing on the technology side of things in itself. So that's absolutely the way forward. Yeah.
Super. Well, Kevin, Sakthi, and Dan, thank you very much for your contributions today. Really appreciated giving us some good insights, and I think also painting a picture that in cybersecurity we don't always hear the other side around this whole digital transformation. I'd encourage anyone who's listening to this to take a look at the Dayton Digital Maturity Survey. I'm sure we'll be sending links out to that. It gives you a very good insight into the trends that ultimately will have an impact, if you like, to cybersecurity. But anyway, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand over to Bill for a final wrap up. Thank you all for joining.
Well, thank you, Nick. I have to say, we allocated an hour for this topic. I reckon we could have taken it much longer. The detail that everybody went into was absolutely first class. So again, a huge thanks to Kevin, Dan, and Sakthi for your input this morning. Absolutely first class. And I hope everybody else has some good takeaways. It's interesting, we talked about some of the great organizations out there. There's some of them I noted that are registered and have been listening to, people like PP, Shell, Chrysalis, Repsol, and various others. I really hope that we get the opportunity to further the conversation with those organizations. I would also like to say a big thank you again to Recorded Future for acting and supporting us as sponsors today. I have some really good news for you, actually. This session will actually be available on demand now. And that means you get the opportunity to share it with your peers and other suppliers. And the other thing is, don't forget to register for the next event, which takes place on the Tuesday, the 6th of October, slightly later at 12 p.m. If you think about what we've been talking about today and the real clear issues, the good thing is at that session, we're actually going to be discussing supply chain risk management. And we're presenting insights from the report that we recently produced to the membership. It actually came out last week. So some really hot topic stuff that we'll be able to discuss there. Again, really adds to what we're talking about today. It's quite interesting, actually, because, you look at a lot of the stuff that we've got in the background, like human-centered security, protecting the crown jewels, and what we've done on the supply chain, all contributes to this conversation. So I'd encourage everybody, look at the registration page, and you've seen downloads to take advantage of them, but also have a look on our website, which is, the Information Security Forum website. If you need any additional information on the ISF or indeed anything else, feel free to to contact me on bill.blass@securityforum.org. A huge thank you to everybody for joining us today. I hope we see you next time. Bye for now.